Hey guys, thanks a lot for clicking on the video. As you can tell by the thumbnail, today we're going to take a look at the 12 worst Nintendo 64 games. So, the Nintendo 64 was launched in North America in 1996, and during its lifetime, a total of 296 games were officially released. When compared to PlayStation's 1100 games and the Sega Saturn's 600 games, that number seems quite small. One might assume that with such a limited library, Nintendo 64 games were carefully selected to ensure that each release would set a new standard in their respective genre, or at the very least, that they were worth the customer's money. Unfortunately, creating a video game is a challenging task where all the elements must come together perfectly to produce an enjoyable product. Various external factors can single-handedly ruin a game. Sometimes it's simply bad timing, and other times it's a lack of production value. While it's true that classics like Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, or No Mercy have left their marks on the gaming history, it's important to remember that these games represented the best of the best. But today, we're going to be taking a look at a different type of game. We're going to be delving into the bottom of the barrel. We're going to take a look at the games that never made it to any of the best of the year lists. The ones that remained on the shelves of your local video game store for years. Each game on this list has managed to upset gamers for one reason or another. These are the forgotten nightmares of their era. These are the 12 worst Nintendo 64 games. Number 12, Daikatana. So, John Romero, a renowned game designer, experienced a regrettable misstep in the late 90s. This led to a well-known advertisement in gaming magazines proudly proclaiming John Romero's about to make you his bitch. The intention was to generate excitement for the upcoming Daikatana, which was believed to be Romero's greatest work. Despite numerous setbacks and an unfortunate change to the game engine, the end result was a chaotic amalgamation of ambition yet undeveloped concepts. Ultimately, the hype surrounding this game proved to be meaningless as the final product fell way short of the expectations. If it was viewed without its tumultuous history, the game could have had a more favorable outcome and simply been recognized as a mediocre shooter. Interestingly, the Game Boy adaptation received better reviews from critics, as it was presented as a Zelda-like adventure instead of a poor shooter. Number 11, WCW Nitro. Now, the wrestling games on the Nintendo 64 stand out from their competition, particularly the first WCW game and later the WWF, now E games developed by Aki. These games are still highly regarded by gamers for their exceptional gameplay. Now, despite the success of the critically acclaimed games released in the late 90s, this decision to release a subpar port of the WCW Nitro game from PlayStation was just frustrating. The Nintendo 64 version featured an unplayable control scheme and matches that ended way too quickly, unlike the original PlayStation version. Also, the removal of the intro videos, which obviously the Nintendo 64 couldn't do, where the real-life WCW wrestlers tried to convince players to choose them in 15 seconds. This took away the unintentional comedy gold that added charm to the game. Without this and other unique features, the rehash version just seemed unnecessary. Just like the promotion the game was based on, it was an inferior product by the late 90s, early 2000s. Number 10, Dual Heroes. Now, occasionally, a product can be so poorly executed that it transcends being simply bad and somehow manages to become so bad that it's good and have a small group of loyal fans. Unfortunately, Dual Heroes failed to achieve even that. Instead, it settled for being outrageously terrible and proudly showcased its mediocrity. The game features characters reminiscent of Power Rangers engaged in battles within a nightmarish setting, all while emphasizing a nonsensical storyline about the impending doom on humanity. In an attempt to emphasize the seriousness of the battles, the game begins with an unskippable introduction that outlines the convoluted plot. Despite the lengthy setup, most matches can be easily won by simply dodging attacks and waiting for the opponent to defeat themselves. Doesn't that sound like a fun fight game experience? Number 9. South Park Rally. South Park Rally attempted to answer the question of what would happen if all the best parts of Mario Kart were taken out. Now, despite being a huge South Park fan myself, the repetitive voice acting can drive even the most dedicated fans crazy. The unresponsive controls and lackluster course design are overshadowed by constant catchphrases like "you bastards" and "hidey ho." After enduring countless farts from Terrence and Phillip, my mind was left numb with a lingering sense of anxiety. This is one of those games where you wanted to like so much when you were a kid. Mario Kart with South Park humor. How could it miss, right? But it did. Number 8. Razor Freestyle Scooter. Now, Razor Freestyle Scooter, or RFS if you're hip, is one of the final releases on the Nintendo 64. While it appears to be a mere imitation of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater with the addition of handlebars on the skateboards, unfortunately, during the cloning process, key elements such as speed, control, and excitement were lost. The lackluster gameplay and unexcited tricks coupled with sluggish character movements created a very dull experience. It seems the game aimed to attract the younger scooter-loving kids, but at the same time there was a cameo by Tito Ortiz from UFC and MMA fame. On a side note, the music, although it was generic, was pretty decent. Coming in at number 7, Olympic Hockey, 98. First off, this isn't a bad game because it's unplayable, it's ranked this high because of what it is. Now, the original Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey provided a fun yet shallow experience of hockey, with an exciting gameplay but lacking in depth with the season mode. Its sequel, 3D Hockey 98, made some improvements to the season mode, but it still fell short of making it truly engaging. Olympic Hockey 98 was released just 3 months after that, and it only changed the team and player names, added flags to the jerseys, and they called it a day. Everything else remains the same, from the game engine to the commentators' lines to the cheat codes. Even the gravity-defying power checks were left untouched in a game meant to represent the cleaner Olympic style. Calling this the laziest video game sequel would be a stretch, but labeling it as a shameless money grab would be more accurate. Plus, come on, if you were playing N64 hockey in the late 90s, chances were it was NHL 98 or 99. Number 6, Clay Fighter, 63 1/3. Now, Clay Fighter attempts to present itself as a satire fighting game, but falls short in terms of both quality and humor. Beyond the quirky character design such as a pumpkin-headed ghost, a hobo Robocop, and a Chinese fighter wielding chopsticks, the gameplay itself is sluggish and easily exploitable through mindless button mashing. A lot of my friends look back fondly on this and the SNES version until they play them again. It still looks decent, but it isn't worth playing through, especially if you want to play a good fighter. The game itself is even overshadowed by its Sculptor's Cut edition, which has become one of the most sought-after Nintendo 64 titles among collectors. Originally released exclusively as a blockbuster rental, the scarcity of this edition is due to the limited number of copies produced and the subsequent destruction of many boxes and manuals over time. If you happen to own a copy, you could potentially sell it from $400 to $750, depending on the condition and completeness. Number 5, Batman Beyond. Now, prior to the Arkham series, which captured the essence of being Batman flawlessly, several games attempted and failed to replicate the experience of becoming the world's greatest detective. Ubisoft correctly identified that a significant aspect of being the Batman involves combat. However, their mistake was assuming that combat alone was enough to be the new Dark Knight, Terry McGinnis. Armed solely with punches and kicks, Batman navigates through room after room, teeming with adversaries whom he pummels repeatedly in a manner very reminiscent of the animated series. Subsequently, after vanquishing his foes, Batman proceeds to the next room, which bears a striking resemblance to the previous one, engaging in a cycle of kicking and punching until your character either A. completes the level, B. Meets their demise, or C. You as the player abandon the game due to monotony and boredom. Number 4. Carmageddon 64. Now, although I wasn't a big fan of the game, I can see the attraction of the original Carmageddon on the PC. The game allowed players to drive recklessly and earn points by running over pedestrians. It's both gross and comical, disgusting yet subversive. The courses were well designed, and the cartoonish way in which each victim exploded takes away some of the guilt. The appeal is definitely there. Carmageddon 64, however, replaces the cartoonish humans and their screams with cardboard-thin zombies that disappear in a scramble of green pixels. I could criticize the loose controls and outdated graphics, but the truth is that the game is nothing like the original. It's Carmageddon in name only, downgrading everything that made the game what it was, and taking away the one thing that made it infamous in the first place. Number 3. Power Rangers Lightspeed Rescue. Now, describing the poor quality of this game is a challenge. Despite being released towards the end of the Nintendo 64's lifespan, the animation and textures are subpar, with laughable grass patches and simplistic sidewalks. However, the graphics are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this game's issues. The gameplay is monotonous, involving running to the end of the map and shooting energy balls at enemies repeatedly. There is no real challenge or danger to the character, making it a very dull experience that can be completed in just an hour. I've played more complex games on the Atari 2600. Number 2. Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero. Now, the rigid controls of Mortal Kombat are acceptable for the fighting game, but they are unacceptable when it's applied to a platformer. The game is barely playable as it is, constantly interrupted by cutscenes that are nothing more than pixelated screenshots of the videos presented in a PlayStation version. Considering how notoriously bad the acting was in those scenes, owners of the N64 version should consider themselves lucky that they never actually had to sit through it. They received the best version of this subpar game. Now, going through this again, I played this for about 15 minutes and this is a slog. It just never felt proper. You know, like, it's a platforming game and you just felt so heavy and you were stuck with those terrible Mortal Kombat style controls. That control scheme does not belong with a platforming game. Number 1. Superman: The New Adventures. Now, like all of my most recent worst and best lists, the ranking really doesn't matter. The order the games are presented in are arbitrary, with the exception of the number 1. And this game is the number 1. I don't know if it's possible for any other game to take its place. Think about it, on the N64, what was worse than this Superman game? Superman has received widespread criticism from almost everyone who's played it, and has even been labeled as the worst game by numerous magazines and websites, beating out Atari 2600's E.T. Even the respected but now defunct Nintendo Power magazine named it as one of the worst games ever released on a Nintendo system. It seems that everything went wrong during the development process. The distant fog is so dense that the developers have dubbed it Kryptonite Fog, as if it were a deliberate feature rather than a game flaw. The controls, graphics, and gameplay are all flawed. Picture a version of hell where you can only see 3 feet in front of you and you're condemned to endlessly circle around. This is an accurate depiction of half the game. This is why Superman is considered the worst N64 game, and some people might say the worst video game of all time. And that's going to be my list of the 12 worst Nintendo 64 games. Now, of course, like I mentioned, ranking doesn't really matter with the exception of Superman, but I'd love to hear how you'd place these games. And is there something I missed? Is there something that you played on the N64 that was absolute garbage that you think should have been on this list? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. I appreciate it. Don't forget to like this video if you actually liked it, and I'll see you in about a week. Take care.